Um, Thank you so much, Mr. Steyer, for sitting down with the Carolinian newspaper. This is a very exciting time, I'm sure. I just have to ask, though, what really possessed you to run for president?
I know. Look, I wasn't planning on it, obviously, but I was listening to the first two debates, and I honestly felt like no one was leveling with the American people. I mean, I believe that the issue in the United States is that corporations have bought the government. That there's a reason we don't have affordable health care. There's a reason we don't have quality public education from pre-K through college. There's a reason why people don't get paid a living wage. And there's a reason why Americans don't have an absolute right to clean air and clean water, that they can be poisoned so other people can make more money. And the reason is that the government's broken. And I've spent 10 years as an outsider in politics fighting those corporations, putting together coalitions of Americans to beat them. And we've been winning. And I was watching those debates and I was like, you guys are talking about healthcare that you can't get through. And you're talking about a Green New Deal that you can't get through. Could we please talk about what's going on, which is we have a broken government that is serving corporations and has been, has abandoned the American people for 40 years. I hear, so to me this is almost a question about access.
Yes.
That you don't have access to decision makers.
Yes.
And yet you're representing a number of papers
Yes.
in the African American community. Let me tell you, I hear that from the highest labor organizers in the country.
Wow.
People who are the head of national unions say they can't get a meeting. There's no response. So and if you think about, okay, so let's step back for 1 second, the Democratic Party. I mean, if you were going to describe what are the most long-lasting, consistent, sort of constituencies of the Democratic Party, would you say the African American community and labor? It's kind of like, holy cow. So what I've seen, and that's my point, is people across the board feel like they don't have access. And these are people representing the biggest Democratic constituencies. It shocked me. But I think the idea that African Americans as a voting bloc, but also as human beings, are being taken for granted. That organized labor, both as a voting bloc and as human beings, are being taken for granted. I think that's look, I've said, this government's broken. Everybody knows it's been bought. Democrats, Trump got in part by saying drain the swamp. He was basically saying the government's corrupt and they don't care about you. And what I say is the government is broken, it's been bought by corporations.
Yeah.
The difference is I have 10 years of putting together coalitions to beat those corporations.
And a track record.
I have a track record, and I've got a track record in terms of registering, engaging, and turning out voters for a broader democracy. And I can tell you that when we registered 1,000,003 people, so 1,300,000 people, 2016, which is the biggest voter registration drive, certainly in my home state of California, but maybe ever. Our biggest partner was the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation Project run by a guy named Mark Ridley Thomas. Biggest partner. We had a lot of partners, but it was always community organizers who'd been there for years or decades. People knew that they were really an organic part of the community, and if they showed up, they weren't just showing up for themselves, that they were committed to the community.
So you said you're in favor of reparations.
I am.
Which, fantastic, but my concern is there needs to be a very solid infrastructure that is put in place well before we can discuss any type of monetary disbursement, because we're talking about generations upon generations that have not had access to education or limited access. I feel like the foundation must be put there before we can put the cherry on top.
And that's a funny way of putting it. Let me put it this way. What I've said, and I want to talk about two things. One about two things I proposed. One, I proposed a commission on race to tell the story of the last 401 years. To tell the story about injustice and legalized discrimination, but also about contribution to the African American community, not just in terms of building the United States, but also in terms of leading the United States morally. That we have to tell that story, we have to have solutions. But I'll give you an example of something that I proposed, which makes your point.
Okay.
I've said that we should spend $125 billion on the historically black colleges and universities over the next 10 years. That's a multiple of what anyone else is saying. But I'm saying it because there's such a strong reason that they exist in the first place, which was to combat legal discrimination that prevented African American kids from going to the mainline colleges and universities. Huge historical reason. Great success. Produced the majority of black judges, engineers, doctors, teachers, generals. Great success. Totally underfunded.
Completely.
Funding reduced by 42% from the federal government over the last 10 years, so starved for cash. So I'm talking about a multiple of what anyone else is talking about. And also talking about setting up a board of regents to make all those schools, which are not really an organization, they're individual separate schools, to make them into more of an organized group so that they can deal with the rest of, with the federal government and state and local governments in a more cohesive fashion, so that they can oversee the disbursement of funds and make sure that it's well done and account for it, so that they're more of it, and it's back to your point, so that it's done in an organized, controlled, managed fashion by people from within the system. And that's exactly the point that I would make about how I see reparations. Tell the true story, because out of that narrative will come policies that actually reflect what's been wrong and what needs to be repaired. And so I can see a lot of different ways this would go. Could there be, one of the things I propose is assistance on down payments on houses. Black people have been prevented from being in the housing market by systematic discrimination by banks for a really long time. We started a community bank to lend where other banks wouldn't lend because we believe in justice.
Does your community bank help with the gentrification and stopping people from losing their houses because
Yes,
the
it
taxes have gone up 4 and 5
We
times?
have pushed really hard in terms of preventing gentrification, just so you know. Which is across the country. But I'm just saying, Adrian, when you say, we can't just put people in a position, jump to the end, we have to do the work. That's my whole point about the commission. Do the work, examine the facts together so that the country as a whole comes to a different agreement about the story. Because out of a true narrative will come fair policy, just policy.
Tony, thank you
So
so
nice
much
to
for
meet
your
you.
time.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ross.